He spent weeks telling me I was imagining things, and then one dinner table conversation destroyed the entire lie in front of everyone. At first, that sounds like the kind of sentence people only say after years of therapy, or after they have told the story so many times that the edges have gone dull. That was not how it felt while I was living it. While I was inside it, everything still looked ordinary enough that I kept trying to save the relationship from my own suspicions. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation smaller than betrayal, kinder than betrayal, easier to survive than betrayal. The truth did not care what I was ready for. When a man lies consistently enough, your nervous system starts living in contradiction. One part of you notices the distance, the secrecy, the odd emotional weather. Another part wants peace badly enough to accept every explanation that postpones the confrontation. That was where I had been living. I knew something was wrong, but I was still hoping the wrong thing had a smaller name than betrayal. The hardest part to explain to people who have never lived through this kind of betrayal is how ordinary love makes you vulnerable in practical ways. You build habits around a person. You assume cooperation. You stop scanning every interaction for danger because commitment is supposed to reduce that burden, not increase it. That is why the early warning signs are so easy to miss. They arrive inside normal life, mixed in with shared meals, errands, bills, inside jokes, and routines that still look solid from a distance. By the time suspicion feels serious, your heart is already heavily invested in preserving a life that may no longer exist in the form you believed. What I did not understand then was how much trust can disguise danger when you are invested in continuity. He was guarded with his phone, unpredictable with his schedule, and impatient whenever I asked for basic honesty. Every concern I raised became evidence that I was insecure. Every inconsistency I pointed out became proof that I was overthinking. He had become so confident in the pattern that he no longer sounded nervous when he lied. That confidence is often the final insult. It means the other person believes reality itself can be managed if they keep speaking firmly enough. I kept minimizing it, because I wanted the relationship to remain something I could repair with patience, rather than something I would have to survive by leaving. What made it worse was not just the event itself. It was the way each new detail forced older memories to change shape. Moments that once felt harmless became loaded. Conversations that once felt routine became suspicious in hindsight. That is one of the ugliest parts of infidelity and deception. It does not only injure the present. It reaches backward and contaminates the meaning of things you once held with trust. What nobody prepares you for is how much energy betrayal steals before the relationship even officially ends. You start rereading old moments, checking your own tone, wondering whether you missed something obvious or whether you were simply loyal in a world that rewards people who hide well. That internal spiral is exhausting because it turns your own memory into a witness you no longer fully trust. I lived inside that spiral longer than I should have, mostly because admitting the full truth would have required me to accept how much of my life was about to change. The truth came out at a family dinner where I had gone intending to survive another uncomfortable evening, not witness a public collapse. Someone mentioned the woman in passing without understanding how much context that one casual reference would unlock. Then another detail slipped, then a date, then a location. I watched the room subtly change as his private lie lost oxygen in real time. It was one of those unbearable moments where everybody realizes the truth almost at once, but no one knows which sentence will officially make it visible. Once suspicion became evidence, I entered a phase I still do not remember fondly. It was part investigation, part emotional free fall. I was checking devices, dates, receipts, and timelines while also trying to function like a normal adult. Every confirmation hurt, yet every confirmation also made me calmer in one specific way. I was no longer crazy. I was no longer misreading tension. The story was real, and because it was real, I could finally stop wasting energy trying to explain away what my instincts had been flagging for far too long. There is always a physical moment when the body understands before the mind does. My stomach dropped, my breathing changed, and the room seemed to narrow around whatever proof I was holding. Once the first crack opened, there was no putting it back. Questions became sharper, his answers became smaller, the timelines stopped matching. The woman's name, which he had treated like a harmless coincidence, suddenly had enough surrounding detail to expose itself as a relationship. Not rumor, not flirtation, not confusion, a relationship. And because it surfaced at dinner, he lost the one thing liars rely on most, private control over the pace of revelation. From that point on, I was no longer trying to decide whether something was wrong. I was trying to measure how long I had been living beside it without fully naming it. The scale of the truth matters because it changes the emotional category of what happened. I should have felt vindicated immediately. Instead, I felt numb. Public truth does not instantly heal private gaslighting. It only ends the argument over what reality is. The emotional damage from being denied for so long still remains. That night I understood how much of my recent exhaustion had come from carrying two incompatible realities, the one I kept observing and the one he kept insisting I should accept. Once the truth emerged, at least I was finally allowed to stop carrying both. Once I understood that, I stopped asking whether the damage could be explained softly. I started asking whether I could respect myself if I kept staying inside a story that required me to deny what was already obvious. Even before I made any final decision, something in me had already started separating clarity from comfort. Comfort would have meant delaying the inevitable softening language, and pretending confusion was still possible. Clarity meant naming what was in front of me without dressing it up. That shift hurt, but it also gave me back a level of internal steadiness I had been losing for a long time. Eventually there is always a confrontation, whether you want one or not. After dinner we spoke alone, if that word still applies after a lie has already collapsed in front of witnesses. He tried to pivot into apology fast, as if speed could reduce damage. He said he had been scared. He said he did not know how to tell me. He said he never wanted it to come out that way. I told him that losing control of the story is not the same as becoming honest. Honesty would have been a choice made earlier, when secrecy still benefited him. In that conversation I learned something I have seen repeated in almost every betrayal story since. When someone has been lying for long enough, exposure does not automatically produce honesty. Often it only produces a faster, more desperate form of strategy. I also learned that closure is rarely given cleanly by the person who caused the damage. More often, closure is assembled privately from facts, behavior, silence, and the eventual realization that you no longer need a better apology in order to make a better decision. That realization was painful because it forced me to stop waiting for the other person to become morally elegant after months of choosing something much uglier. After the confrontation, the aftermath begins, and the aftermath is rarely cinematic. It is practical, repetitive, humiliating, and emotionally expensive. The days after were humiliating in practical ways. Family members checking in. Some embarrassed for him, some for me, some simply desperate to make the whole thing smaller because scandal makes people uncomfortable. But the affair itself did not get smaller just because the room wanted relief. If anything, the public exposure forced me to stop softening the truth. There is also a social cost to betrayal that people underestimate. You start thinking about who knew what, who suspected what, and who watched the relationship deteriorate without saying a word. Even when no one intended to humiliate you, the mere possibility that other people noticed pieces of the truth before you did can feel like a second wound. It is not pure ego. It is the pain of realizing your private devastation may have had an audience long before you had language for it yourself. And then comes the part no one glamorizes. The paperwork, the practical decisions, the humiliating phone calls, the explanations you owe people who were never in the room when your life actually broke. Meals still have to be made. Bills still have to be paid. Work still expects your attention. Meanwhile, your mind is replaying scenes it cannot fix. That contrast between ordinary responsibility and extraordinary pain is one of the loneliest parts of the whole process. In the end, my decision was less dramatic than people imagine and more important than any single argument. I left with a steadier mind than I expected, because once the truth becomes communal, the liar can no longer isolate you inside your own doubt. That gave me strength. Not because I needed witnesses to validate my pain, but because I no longer had to spend energy arguing with someone committed to falsifying my experience. I could finally move directly into grief and decision instead of wasting myself in endless proof. That decision did not erase grief. It simply gave grief a direction. Instead of circling endlessly around the betrayal, I began moving away from it, step by difficult step. Recovery did not begin with peace. It began with routine. I had to rebuild trust in small, unglamorous ways, by keeping promises to myself, by protecting my sleep, by speaking honestly to the people who had earned access to my life, and by refusing to keep confusing suffering with loyalty. That process was slower than I wanted and less dramatic than movies teach us to expect. But it was real, and reality mattered more to me now than performance ever could. A major part of recovery had nothing to do with the other person and everything to do with identity. I had to figure out who I was when I was no longer organizing my choices around managing their moods, their lies, or the fallout from their decisions. That sounds abstract until you live it. Then it becomes very practical. Different mornings, different habits, different spending, different boundaries, different standards for what gets access to your time. The rebuild was not only emotional, it was structural, and that structural change is what made the healing last instead of feeling temporary. He lied about his affair, but the truth came out at dinner because lies are fragile things once enough reality enters the room. I did not get justice in some dramatic cinematic way. I got clarity. And clarity, when you have been gaslit for long enough, feels holy. It gave me back my mind. From there, rebuilding the rest was possible. I do not tell this story because I enjoy revisiting it. I tell it because there are people still living inside the version of confusion I once called normal. If you are one of them, I hope you understand this. Clarity may arrive quietly, but once it arrives, it asks something of you. It asks whether you will keep protecting a lie because you are afraid of what truth will cost,